Who doesn't love a bit of Ed Sheeran first thing? A very good morning to you wherever you're watching us around the world. We start with breaking news on the economy. New figures from the Office for National Statistics show inflation has unexpectedly gone up to 10.4% in February. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, was expected to come down from January's 10.1%. Oh, my goodness me. How bad news is that for the government? Gurpreet is here. Hi, good morning. Tell us more.
Yeah, it's a bit worrying for policymakers. Economists were expecting inflation to come down to 9.9%. But we've had this surprise leap in inflation to 10.4%. Now, this has just dropped, so we don't know exactly what's caused it, but some of the early signs suggest that it's food inflation and restaurants and cafes that have been driving this.
Food inflation 18%, I'm being told.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that wouldn't be a surprise. It was around 16% the previous month. And crucially, for the Bank of England, this is way above where it was penciling in inflation to be around this time of the year, which means that there's more pressure now on the bank to raise interest rates when policymakers meet next week. And of course, there are other worrying signs in the economy as well. The labour market, although it's starting to soften, wages are still rising pretty robustly, even though they are lagging behind inflation. And if wages rise too quickly, that could put pressure on prices, because businesses have to raise their prices in order to protect their profits. And of course, inflation is also 5 times the Bank of England's 2% target. And although in recent weeks and days, market expectations of where interest rates might end up have come down, this suggests that they might have to ratchet them back up again.
Just very quickly, what does this mean for our mortgages?
Well, it means that, as I just said, that interest rates might have to stay longer for higher,
will they go higher still?
They could do. So in recent weeks and in recent days, markets have expected that interest rates might actually peak at a much lower level than we were expecting, and that the Bank of England might not actually even raise interest rates when it meets next week. But all of this suggests that it may have to.
OK, for now, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. In other news, Boris Johnson will face MPs later for a grilling that could decide his political future. He's fighting for his political life today. Former Prime Minister has admitted misleading the House of Commons over Downing Street parties in lockdown, but insists it wasn't intentional. If he's unable to convince the Privileges Committee, Mr Johnson could be suspended from Parliament and even ultimately face a by-election. Liz has more.
Are you confident your evidence will clear you, Mr Johnson?
No more walking away for the former Prime Minister, who today must finally face MPs and 4 hours of questions over whether he recklessly misled Parliament over partygate. Back in December 2020, as evidence that illegal gatherings had taken place in Downing Street mounted, Boris Johnson repeatedly told the House of Commons no rules had been broken.
All guidance was followed completely during Number 10. I have been repeatedly assured since these allegations emerged that there was no party and that no COVID rules were broken. The guidance was followed and the rules were followed at all times.
We now know that wasn't true. It's up to the Privileges Committee to decide whether he knew that at the time. Yesterday, they published his defence, a 50-page dossier drawn up by lawyers, arguing that during his rule-breaking birthday party, no cake was even eaten, that he couldn't have known about the other parties because he was working day and night, blaming his aides, saying no one advised me after any of these events that they were against the rules.
People do mislead the House by accident. You know, that you misspeak. If you say you have to understand every single nuance and you're going to be held to account based on new facts received and punished on that basis, ministers will simply come to the dispatch box and say, I can't possibly comment. We're going to have an inquiry. I can't talk about that.
His allies say it's a Labour stitch-up because the committee chair is party grandee Harriet Harman, despite Conservative MPs being in the majority.
I think he's saying it to try to weasel out of it, frankly. This is a man who has never taken responsibility for anything in his life and doesn't intend to start now.
The committee's verdict could lead to a suspension and even a by-election in his Uxbridge and Ruislip constituency. But it's not just his political future. The current Prime Minister's is also on the line. as the scandal that has haunted the Conservative Party rears its head once again. Liz Bates, Sky News, Westminster.
Just underlining those figures before we move on to more about Boris Johnson. Food inflation up 18%, almost a fifth. Impact it's having on you. Do let us know your thoughts. You can tweet me directly at Kay Burley. Also, the inflation figure staying in double figures. So many thought that it would come down to about 9.8, 9.9%. That's not happening. A few jitters in Downing Street this morning, not least because of the Privileges Committee. They're going to publish new material ahead of that hearing later on this morning. That's when they're going to print it, but publish it, I should say. But the actual hearing, there we go, we're getting there, 2 o'clock this afternoon. So fresh information this morning, the hearing at 2 p.m. this afternoon. It's going to last about 4 hours or so. Boris Johnson fighting for his political life. And if that wasn't enough for Rishi Sunak, his new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland, that goes to a Commons vote today, and the Prime Minister faces rebellion on his own benches. And not long ago, Boris Johnson said that he will be voting against Rishi Sunak's Windsor framework. In a statement, the former PM said the proposals were unacceptable, adding that the best course of action is to proceed with Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. Eurosceptic Tory MPs have hinted they'll vote against the deal as well. They're critical of the so-called Stormont break, which is intended to provide a veto on the imposition of new EU regulations in Northern Ireland. The Prime Minister can rely on the support of Labour and other parties in getting the deal passed. Some of today's other headlines for you on the programme this morning. A man has been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder after another man was set on fire while walking home from a mosque in Birmingham on Monday evening. Counter-terror police are now investigating the incident along with the West Midlands Police, warning that viewers may find the following images, which include the moment the man was set on fire, distressing. The images were captured on CCTV and they show the victim being stopped in the street by another man who points his finger at him. The attacker then appears to push the man to prevent him from getting past. Moments later, the pair move up the road. You can see them to the left of the screen. There they are. And the victim is then set on fire. A man has been arrested. At least 13 people are known to have died in Pakistan and Afghanistan after a 6.5 magnitude earthquake shook both countries. The tremor was also felt in parts of India and several central nations across Central Asia. Uganda's parliament has overwhelmingly approved a new bill further targeting the LGBTQ+ community that already faces legal discrimination and mob violence. It allows jail terms of up to 10 years for same-sex relations and potentially the death penalty for what's described as aggravated homosexuality when it involves people under 18. Gwyneth Paltrow has appeared in court over a skiing accident that happened back in 2016. Terry Sanderson says she crashed into him on the slopes and left him permanently injured and is suing for $300,000. The actor argues that it was Mr. Sanderson who caused the accident and is counter-suing for $1. The government has reportedly scrapped plans to bring forward a rise in the state pension age. The age, which is currently 66, was due to rise to 68 after 2044. Reports had suggested that ministers plan to bring the increase forward to the end of the next decade, which would affect people who are now in their early 50s. According to the FT, the government has decided to delay a decision because of falling life expectancy and concerns about anger among aged voters. A Department for Work and Pensions spokesperson said the government is required by law to regularly review the state pension age, and the next review will be published by the 7th of May. The pension age is still due to rise to 67 by the end of 2028. And we want to know what you think about that story today. How do you feel about working until the age of 68? The Chancellor says the pension age will have to rise, but ministers could try to push it until after the next election. You can share your thoughts with me on Twitter at Kay Burley, and I'll read them out on the telly for the whole world to listen to. So how do you feel about potentially working till the age of 68? Remember that the French have been rioting because it's increasing age from pension age from 62 to 64 Brits could work to the age of 68 potentially by the mid-2040s. Thoughts on that, if you wouldn't mind, please, at Kay Burley. In other news, research has found women may face an increased breast cancer risk from taking any kind of hormonal contraceptive. The Oxford University scientists behind the study were keen, however, to emphasise that their findings should be taken in the context of the drug's well-established benefits. Alice is with us. Hi, Alice. Good morning to you. Tell us a bit more. So, how worried should women on the taking contraceptive pills this morning, or other forms of contraception as well, be this morning?
They shouldn't be worried. I think that's really, really important to stress. We know that women who take the combined pills, so that's progesterone and estrogen, we know that those women have always had a slight increase of getting breast cancer. But this has been one of the few studies to look at those who are taking the progesterone-only pill, so also known as the mini pill. That's increased in popularity a lot over the last few years, and that's why researchers from Oxford University, that's why they wanted to examine what those increased risks would be. So they looked at around 30,000 patient records, and they found for those women who take progesterone-only pills over 5 years, that increased their chances over the next 15 years of getting breast cancer by around 20 or 30%. Now, that sounds a lot, but in actual real terms of an actual increase in cases, if we looked at 100,000 women who took this progesterone-only pill, it would mean you'd only have an extra 8 cases of breast cancer if they took the pill into their late 20s. And for those who take the pill into their late 30s, it's only an extra 264 women. So the numbers are very small. And also, crucially, your chances of having breast cancer in your 20s and 30s are quite low, and you're more likely to take the pill than someone in your late 30s and 40s who have an increased risk of breast cancer.
OK, as far as the coil is concerned, that's caught up in this as well, isn't it?
Yes, as well. I mean, across the board, it's important to stress that all women, depending on what contraceptive they take, there is an increased chance of them having breast cancer. But it's important to stress as well, their chances of having ovarian cancer and womb cancer are decreased significantly by taking any form of contraception as well. So it's all about weighing up the pros and cons. But if anyone is watching this and they've got concerns, talk to your GP, talk to your family planning about it.
And risks getting pregnant as well under whatever circumstances. Thanks very much indeed, Alice. Thank you. Now, as the Met Police digest Baroness Casey's damning review, Sky News has uncovered bullying and misogyny at another force. We've spoken to a serving officer at Humberside Police who say she was left traumatised by sexual abuse from a fellow officer. Jason has more for us. He was here yesterday. Hi, Jason. Good morning. Tell us more.
So obviously yesterday was a day of reckoning for the Metropolitan Police, being told that they were institutionally misogynistic, racist and homophobic. And we've been told this is going to take a long time for this all to be resolved within the Met. But at the same time, I was talking to Baroness Casey and I asked her, do you think there should be a review similar to yours in other police forces? And she said she thought there should be. And the reason I asked the question is because we had seen in Humberside Police testimony from women suggesting that there is misogyny there. And actually the parallels between Louise Casey's review and some of the examples in there were striking. So as you say, we have the story of a police officer who is still serving within the force and an alleged rape victim who manages to get a subject access request, which is to find out all the information about herself and what's been said about her by the police. And you can see it in this report.
For a while, seeing a police officer in uniform, I'd have like flashbacks. If something happened to me again, I don't think I'd ever report it.
This is a serving police officer, so traumatised by the abuse from a fellow officer, she's questioning her own force. Humberside Constabulary was rated outstanding by the police inspectorate, but Sally says when it became known that she'd reported a fellow officer for sexual violence, her colleagues rallied around him.
I was ostracised, given the cold shoulder, so I'd be stared at or given dirty looks. They were like schoolyard bullies. After the misconduct hearing, so after he lost his job, I lost count of the amount of officers that came up to me and said, "Oh, he's always been like that."
Really?
Yeah, and he'd been in the job a really long time. And I thought, well, why have they not said anything then?
Yeah.
He basically had the same nicknames as those monsters in the Met.
Wayne Couzens was nicknamed the rapist by fellow officers before he murdered Sarah Everard. David Carrick, a serial rapist, was in the same unit. Now the Casey Review has found the Met Police is institutionally sexist. But does it go wider?
Should there be a Louise Casey type review into every other police force?
I actually think the answer to that is yes, because I think that what we have found, there are some things there like vetting, like sort of the cultural issues, particularly around race and around women. I think that they are national issues.
Anna alleged as a teenager that she was being raped by a gang of men in Hull. She used what's called a subject access request to get Humberside Police records on herself. She found these types of comments made by officers. If the reports are genuine, we have a very vulnerable victim who keeps putting herself in danger. This is a very regular occurrence. The female herself is making lifestyle choices of her own. This victim doesn't come across as the best type of witness victim that I've seen.
I was really vulnerable. I was on a protection plan. It said how I was getting strangled, I was being sexually assaulted, I was high risk, but there's no wonder the case was never brought to court, because before it's even got there, they've completely undermined it.
In one extract, police seem to accept the alleged attacker's story that there is bruising on Anna because she liked violent sex. After a review, Anna's investigation was reopened, and for that reason, Humberside Police say they can't comment further. But Deputy Chief Constable Paul Anderson said child sexual abuse and exploitation is a deplorable and condemnable crime, and we're determined to bring offenders to justice and hold them accountable for their actions. With regard to Sally, the force says misogynistic behaviour will not be tolerated, adding there is an existing robust process in place. Anyone who exhibits any form of misogynistic or discriminatory behaviour will be held accountable for their actions. Sally says she's still proud to be a police officer, but is speaking out because she wants change. Louise Casey's report suggests that will only come if all officers have the same attitude.
So Louise Casey's review, which has rocked the Met, is something she believes should be extended out to other police forces. And from the testimony of just those two women, it does seem as if this is a problem that extends far beyond just one police force.
OK, for now. Thanks very much indeed, Jason. Thank you. Jason with us throughout the morning on The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. Hopefully you will be too. 7 police officers among 10 people indicted in the US state of Virginia over the death of a mentally ill man in custody. Ovo Otieno died when he was being transported from the Henrico County Jail to a state-run psychiatric facility. A warning that the following video shows officers and health workers piling on top of Mr. Otieno before his death. The 28-year-old was handcuffed and in leg irons when he was led to a chair in the admission room. The deputies appear to lose their grip on Mr. Otieno and he's seen falling to the floor. At least 9 people held Mr. Otieno down, and the footage shows he was restrained for a total of 11 minutes. In other news, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has said that Moscow will be forced to react if the UK sends depleted uranium tank shells to Ukraine. The Russian leader made his comments during the visit to Moscow by Chinese leader Xi Jinping. They came in response to a parliamentary answer from Defence Minister Annabel Goldie that the UK would supply Ukraine with armour-piercing rounds which contain depleted uranium for use with its Challenger 2 tanks.
It seems that the West really decided to fight with Russia to the last Ukrainian, not in words but deeds. But in this regard, I'd like to note that if this happens, then Russia will be forced to react accordingly, given that the West is already starting to use weapons with a nuclear component.
Well, the Ministry of Defence has dismissed that warning, saying in a statement that the British Army has used depleted uranium in its armour-piercing shells for decades. It's a standard component and it has nothing to do with nuclear weapons or capabilities. Russia knows this, but is deliberately trying to misinform. China's President Xi is visiting Russia, as you know, for the first time since the invasion of Ukraine. Day 3, Helen Ann standing by for us. How's it gone? Helen Ann, good morning.
Good morning. I think both leaders would feel from their perspectives it's gone reasonably well. President Xi is on his way home now. In terms of concrete outcomes, if you like. We know that a number of bilateral deals were signed between the two to sort of further deepen already pretty deep and existing trade ties. But the one thing that a lot of people really had their eyes on this summit was whether there would be any form of proposal or deal, suggestion, maybe even ceasefire proposal as pertains to that all-important war in Ukraine. And on that, there hasn't really been anything particularly concrete. On that war in Ukraine, President Xi said that the negotiations on that were friendly, frank and open. Perhaps just a smidge of a hint there that there are still things over which the two leaders don't see eye to eye on. And Putin, for his part, said that he took very seriously President Xi's, what he calls a peace proposal that he put forward, and that it could be the basis for further movement. But look, I think the real messages out of this state summit were that those two nations wanted to show the world that they are very close, very united. You could see that in all the pomp and ceremony, all the closeness, all the gestures. It was very, very clear. But also, crucially, it is President Xi who has the upper hand in this relationship, no doubt about that. Russia needs China, and China, of course, has its own geopolitical interests in staying close to Russia. It says it wants to be peacemaker, but remember that Russia not losing and being defeated by the West in Ukraine is important to China's geopolitical positioning as well.
OK, Helen Ann, thank you. Back home, politics at home, Boris Johnson facing a bruising cross-examination by MPs at Partygate this afternoon. Before that starts at 2 p.m, let's speak to Conservative MP Peter Bone, a long-standing defender of the former PM throughout Partygate, with us now. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Always great to see you. Thanks for joining us on the programme. Is he fighting for his political life today?
Not really. I mean, what it is a part of the process of the Privileges Committee. He will present, he's already presented his evidence, which is pretty strong in his favour, and he will answer the questions for quite a considerable amount of time today, which I'm sure everyone will be interested in. Then the committee will go away, mull over these things and reach a decision.
If the committee decides that he should be suspended, and he's suspended for 10 days or more, he could face a by-election.
Well, that's not quite right. The committee can only recommend to Parliament, then the whole of the House of Commons votes on whatever.
That was my shorthand, but that's what I would say.
And, I mean, I don't think for one moment they're going to reach that decision, because if you look at objectively, to say that Boris Johnson knowingly lied to Parliament...
Misled.
Well, knowingly misled, lied, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's just... there's no evidence of it. I mean, haven't they had thousands and thousands of WhatsApp messages, and they've been going on for this inquiry for 10 months and found nothing?
That's not quite what the committee is saying. They've released their preliminary findings ahead of Mr Johnson appearing before them, as you know, and it would suggest that they don't think that that's the case, and he very much has a case to answer.
Well, I don't think they've reached a conclusion. I'm sure they haven't reached it.
Preliminary findings.
Yeah, well,
we're being very pedantic this morning, aren't we? Have you had 3 shredded wheat?
Well, you know, getting up early and the excitement of coming on your programme. I did have my breakfast before coming.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm sure that Boris Johnson will need a good breakfast before he gets in front of this
probably
committee,
asleep, Boris, at the moment.
As well. But, you know, they do think he has a case to answer, which is why he's up in front of them.
Well, this is the primary facier thing about, well, it might be a case, so you look at and there's an inquiry. And it's sort of based on the Sue Gray investigation. We now know that Sue Gray is, going to be Chief of Staff to Keir Starmer.
Potentially.
And they were having discussions while the investigation was going on.
No, they weren't. They were having...
Now, who's been pedantic? Have you had your shredded wheat this morning?
I don't like shredded wheat, but if I did, I would have.
Well, actually, nor do I.
Yeah, no, she was having discussions with them during the committee investigation, not during her actual investigation.
I'm glad you corrected me.
Not at all.
But you wouldn't... You will... I mean, if they are calling witnesses, presumably Sue Gray would be called, and she is now... very closely involved with the leader of the Labour Party, which must... I mean, I don't think in a court of law that would be allowed. It would be clearly a conflict of interest.
But so many of your colleagues sat there over the previous months during the investigation saying we must wait for the Sue Gray inquiry because she is a very independent civil servant.
And we didn't know at that time... Well, I've said it, as I said in the House of Commons, I think the fact that a senior civil servant has gone straight from that role to being a senior advisor to the leader of the Labour Party.
What are you
drives a
suggesting?
coach and horses through our civil service.
Be careful, because, of course, you're not protected by parliamentary privilege sat there. What are you suggesting? Are you suggesting that she is biased towards the Labour Party and so she came up with those conclusions?
No, what I'm saying, and I said it in the House of Commons, that, you know, we have this tradition of the civil service being there to advise people of any political persuasion, and they don't then go and join a political party. And that's what is strange, and it breaks with the tradition, and it's more like we're moving towards the American system, where you appoint people who believe in what you do, and then when you leave, you change them. It's a big question for the civil service.
What do you think was going through Boris Johnson's mind then when he was eating cake on his birthday and was raising a glass of wine in photographs that we've seen, and was aware of at least 14 events that were taking part in Downing Street, and was also fined by the Metropolitan Police?
Well, the only event that he got fined for was the cake when he was having a work meeting, and somebody turned up as a surprise piece of cake, which, by the way, was published at the time. In fact, it was in the Times newspaper, and nobody thought anything of it. It wasn't pre-planned by Boris, so none of the other...
So why did he accept that he'd broken the rules?
Well, because the police found him guilty of doing it. Mm. But that was the only event, wasn't it?
He didn't have to accept that fine, did he? He could have challenged it in court. He chose not to.
Well, I'm sure he could have done. But the point is, you're saying he was at lots of these different, what you would call parties, but he wasn't.
No, I was saying he was at 14 separate events, and that's what he will have to be answering. What did he think they were?
They're work meetings, yeah.
And do you often have wine at work meetings?
I don't drink.
OK. Well, that's...
Do you? When Sky has a business meeting, do you occasionally have a drinks with it?
We don't tend to. No, we don't have alcohol.
On occasion?
We don't have alcohol on the premises. And if you have
perhaps off the premises.
Well, exactly so. We certainly do then. We'll have to wait and see what happens as far as whether the committee believe him today. It is 4 Conservatives. The head of the committee, the chairperson, of course, is Labour, and then we have SNP and Lib Dem as well.
Can I just, on that, the only thing I would say about the committee, and I'm a great fan of parliamentary committees, is I'm very surprised that when the previous chairman stood down because he'd prejudged it, Chris Brighton, the right to stand down, the replacement was a former interim leader of the Labour Party, twice interim leader of the Labour Party, had already prejudged the matter. I thought that...
Do you think she's biased as well?
Well, I'm just saying it's strange, isn't it? I could have thought of a lot of Labour MPs who hadn't prejudged it, who could have been chairman. But I thought that was rather... So
are you saying she's biased?
Pardon?
Are you saying she's biased?
I'm not saying... I'm just saying it's unusual.
OK, as long as you're not saying she's biased, because obviously they would have something to say about that. Let me talk quickly about the vote today, Northern Ireland Protocol. Boris Johnson says he is going to vote against it. What are you going to do? Well,
we were promised...
It's one particular aspect, I should say.
Yes, that's the point you're making. Yeah. We were promised a full debate on the Windsor framework, and we would have a whole day debate, and then we'd vote on it. What we're actually being asked in 90 minutes is to vote on one specific aspect.
The Stormont break.
Which is then apparently going to be our vote on the whole framework. Now, if I get a question at PMQs, I'm going to ask the Prime Minister what happened to our wider vote. So I'm really pretty miffed that they are avoiding, the government's avoiding scrutiny on this. And on the break itself, it seems to fail all the tests. In fact, it's sort of be worse than useless. So if that is the case, I'm going to listen to the debate. I'm going to go to meetings this morning. But if I had to vote at this moment of time, I should vote against.
Let's wait and see. Let's see if you get a question at PMQs. If you do, you'll be on the telly because we're covering it live from noon. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, always. Thank you. Obviously, we'll get more on that. It gets PMQs live midday here on Sky News. And then that blockbuster, 2 p.m. this afternoon, when Boris Johnson has hours and hours and hours of questioning about what happened behind the front door of Downing Street. We'll cover that for you live as well. Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. Wednesday morning. If you're queasy about spiders, look away now. Previously unknown species of trapdoor spider has been discovered in Australia. Researchers at Queensland Museum describe it as big and beautiful. Its body alone can grow to 5 centimetres and they can live as long as 20 years in bushland. Ugh, horrible. Top stories this morning. Boris Johnson is fighting for his political future as he prepares to face a grilling by MPs about whether he knowingly misled Parliament over partygate. Rate of inflation has taken a surprise leap to 10.4%, driven by record food costs at 18%. Sky News uncovers allegations of misogyny and bullying at Humberside Police, with one female serving officer telling us she's lost faith in the fourth. Keir Starmer under fire for seeking to block the government's plans to relax tax rules on pensions for the wealthy. The Daily Telegraph says the Labour leader is benefiting from a generous pension arrangement from his time as Director of Public Prosecutions. It's the lead in the Telegraph this morning. What on earth is going on? Tamara, hi. So one rule for one?
That's what Tory MPs are saying. So in the budget, Jeremy Hunt abolished the lifetime allowance on pensions, saying that that would help doctors stay in the profession. There had been a cap of £1 million, and beyond that you were taxed a lot on your pension. Now the Telegraph are revealing that Keir Starmer, back when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, had his own pension scheme, which was different to everybody else's, in which there was no cap. So he benefited, they say, and now he's trying to restrict that benefit for other people. And the likes of Ian Duncan-Smith have said that this is as close to hypocrisy as it is possible to get. Now, I understand that when he had that pension scheme, he didn't actually reach the £1 million cap. He could have done, but he didn't actually reach it. And he's not paid into it since he stopped doing that job back in 2013. And of course, George Osborne then raided pensions in the years after that. A Labour spokesperson says, of course, that the pension scheme is set by the government of the day. It wasn't set by the Director of Public Prosecutions himself. But I think as this row escalates, of course, Labour forced a vote on it yesterday. We will expect to see many Conservatives pointing at Keir Starmer and saying, well, this is something that you got. Why shouldn't other people have it too? Labour say they're opposing it because it doesn't just apply to doctors, it also applies to bankers as well.
OK, and I think there's some fun stuff happening at 9 o'clock that we can't talk about at the moment, otherwise you're going to have to kill us. But it's certainly being reflected in the papers
Boris
this morning.
Johnson.
Boris Johnson, indeed. So that's lots of coverage on Boris and Partygate in the papers today. They weren't proper whoppers, reads the Metro, on the former PM's defence that he did mislead MPs, but only accidentally. The Guardian describes Mr Johnson fighting for political survival. But the Mail is in his corner saying, bullish Boris, up for the fight. Away from that, the Telegraph writes, just hearing that the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, is accused of hypocrisy over a unique pension deal that's exempt from tax rules. And the Times carries a study which found a slightly increased breast cancer risk from taking any kind of hormonal contraception. Finally, the FT reporting that a decision on raising the state pension age to 68 has been delayed, partly because of falling life expectancy. Nominations for this year's TV BAFTA Awards have just been announced. Our entertainment and arts reporter Claire Gregory is here. Hi, Claire, tell me more.
Yeah, so it's an interesting year. The top nominations this year have gone to This Is Going to Hurt, which I don't know if you remember was the medical drama. It's based on the book by Adam Kay, so very much kind of written in real-life experiences, inspired by those. And then the other top nominated show is The Responder, which saw Martin Freeman playing a police officer, also written by a former police officer. So really, it seems like BAFTA have kind of looked at things that reflect real life experience. Perhaps after the pandemic, we weren't really looking for TV that gave us huge amounts of escapism. And in fact, instead, we wanted stuff that reflected our own realities. Also doing very well this year in the nominations is The Crown. That often does well at the TV BAFTAs. The English, which is a Western series starring Emily Blunt and Chaskey Spencer, set in 1890. Slow Horses, which is a good one.
Oh, it's great,
yes.
Slow Horses.
I'm glad you like that one. It's one of my favourites too. Yeah, and again...
When that wins.
Yeah, and when we think of Slow Horses, again, it's not the kind of glamorous James Bond world of spies and things, is it? It's kind of the gritty MI5, kind of M25 world of
well, it's about,
spies.
I'm sorry, if I may, it's about MI5 officers who aren't actually very good anymore or have to be reprogrammed, so they go to the old boy who tries to, and then they solve a couple of crimes.
That's it, and Gary Oldman stars.
Oh, he's so good.
And he's up for an acting award for it as well. And then and Bad Sisters, which is another Apple TV Plus show about a kind of group of sisters who find themselves under investigation for a life insurance claim when one of their husbands dies unexpectedly.
And one of ours as well with White Lotus.
White Lotus, I'm afraid, didn't make the list. I think it wasn't in the qualifying period. I think that's what went wrong. But Sky has got some shows in there. The BBC are leading the charge this year. They've got almost 50 nominations, but Sky aren't too far behind. Again, the TV BAFTAs, they always tend to sort of put the terrestrial shows, the linear TV shows, they like to kind of lift those up. So we're seeing more nominations for those than for Sky and for the streamers.
Well, we'll have to change that, won't we? When do we know who's won?
So the ceremony itself will be hosted by the comedians Rob Beckett and Ramesh Ranganathan, and that will be in May, the 14th of May.
OK, fantastic. Thanks so much indeed. Thank you. Now, Ed Sheeran, who doesn't like a bit of Ed Sheeran, says he's vowed to never touch another illicit substance after a coroner ruled that the death of his friend Jamal Edwards was drug-related.
My bad habits lead to white eyes staring into space, and I know I lose control of the things that I say.
Love a bit of Ed. Love a bit of Ed, don't we? In the morning, the singer told Rolling Stone magazine he also felt he couldn't go on after the music entrepreneur's death at 31 just over a year ago. Edwards helped launch Sheeran's career. So we're going to have more on that. And also, you'll never guess whose birthday it is today. Also, musically related, but I'm not going to tell you any more about that just at the moment. Don't forget also, we've got Boris Johnson. He is going to be speaking to the Privileges Committee. They've said, come along and have a chat about what was happening at Downing Street. He spent £250,000 of our money, legal fees, so far. 50-page document was given to the committee a couple of days ago, Monday evening, to be precise. And then he is now being asked to go and back up what he said in these documents. 2 o'clock this afternoon is when Boris Johnson will be doing that. It will be live on Sky News. Before that, of course, it's PMQs at midday today. And in addition to that, there will be a vote on the Stormont stop for the Northern Ireland Protocol, or the Westminster, Windsor Accord, I think it's called, Windsor Framework as it's called now. It's had so many names. Where are we on it? We'll be talking about that. Before that, though, the Metropolitan Police digesting Baroness Casey's damning review, which accused the force of institutional racism, sexism and homophobia. But there are sometimes concerns that even following stinging criticism, official reports don't always lead to change. In Scotland, however, misogyny is set to become a crime following a review from the barrister and Labour peer, Baroness Helena Kennedy, who is with us now. Baroness Kennedy, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us on the programme. First of all, talk to me, if you would, please, about Louise Casey's report. What did you think?
Well, it really is. I mean, it's really hot when you're reading it because it's so excoriating about policing conduct. And, you know, Louise Casey is a very, very smart woman. She is, nobody pulls the wool over her eyes. And I just thought that she pulled no punches. She tells it like it is. And the report is really a shocking read. We've been hearing things about policing over many years now, but somehow the move from receiving reports into doing something really substantial about it is the thing that never happens. And so the challenge now is going to be, can the Met and those at the leadership really take hold of this report and turn the Met around? And that's going to be God's own challenge. It really is, because it's so embedded, this bad behaviour, this discrimination, this sort of, and it comes out of a sense of being a force, and that you owe loyalty to each other, and that somehow there are these rituals that, you know, like urinating on people when they come in, debasing people, in order somehow to create this primacy of the toxic masculinity that operates within policing. And that has to all be challenged if we're going to have a police force that works for everybody.
We've been hearing from the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. She said that there should be a national standard for police vetting procedures. I mean, you have looked at the police up in Scotland's rules slightly differently, but I'm sure you agree that there should be vetting procedures. How would that work, though?
Well, I mean, listen, it's very tricky to do this sort of thing. I mean, I think people should be prepared to hand over, for example, their phones. I mean, they'd have to do it voluntarily. You can't invade people's privacy without their consent. But I think people who are applying for these jobs should be willing to let people see the kind of exchanges that they have on their WhatsApp, the stuff that they have on their phones. This is, this is a way of seeing whether people are actually misogynistic. It was only by looking at the WhatsApp groups in the policing that people got to understand just how deep-rooted misogyny and racism and homophobic attitudes were so deeply embedded in the police. Now, I conducted an inquiry in Scotland, which was a different kind of inquiry. It was looking at the experiences of women in the public from other men. It was about misogyny more generally in society and how it could be addressed through the criminal justice system. And but in doing that, I had received the sort of input from the police, and it was very standard, and I got a very interesting set of suggestions and so on the subject from the police. But I spoke, giving confidentiality to women police officers. I spoke to women police officers who told me that inside the force itself, it was a very different ballpark, and that they themselves experienced really quite shocking levels of misogyny and degrading words on a regular basis. And so, this is not just happening in the Met. I think that it's about something that's generally in our society, as we know, but it's particularly present in these institutions that used to be completely male, and therefore a culture has been created which is very masculine, very sexist, very hostile to men who are not sufficiently machismo. And so there's a horrible exchanges around homosexuality, but diminishing people from minorities, but also being really shocking about women. And until you diversify your police force, have it with many more different kinds of people, that you actually start disentangling this stuff and challenging it at every turn and not punishing the people who challenge it. And unfortunately, within the police, it's seen as disloyalty to in any way call out the behaviour of a colleague. And we would see it regularly. I've been practicing in the bar for so many decades now. You would see it when police officers came to court, this business where you stand together, you allow no breach in your numbers, and therefore you cover up bad behaviour. And it led to miscarriages of justice well in the past. It leads to bad behaviour towards minorities, and it leads to a shocking disregard for the complaints that women make about what's happening to them, because the attitudes of the men who are doing these terrible things to women is often shared by police officers. Not all, but enough to make it a really alarming situation for us as a society. We need to have good policing. And there are many good police officers, and I know them. But the challenge to this is going to be a hard one.
Baroness Kennedy, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us on the programme. Thank you. Before the break, I asked you about the musical maestro who's celebrating a birthday today. Did you guess who it was? He's not afraid of ghosts. It's Andrew Lloyd Webber. Baron Lloyd Webber, who turns 75 today. He's famous for Broadway's longest-running show, Phantom of the Opera, as well as Cats and many, many, many others. His latest is a musical comedy reimagining Cinderella, of course, no longer playing here in the UK, but is around the world. Turning now to Donald Trump, and the former president could be indicted by a grand jury as soon as this week over alleged hush money paid to porn star Stormy Daniels during his 2016 presidential campaign. Joined now by political activist and lawyer Dr. Scholar, and also US political commentator Scotty Nell Hughes. Hello to you both. Good to see you this morning. We've been talking about this quite a lot this week already, ladies, not least with John Bolton, former ambassador, who says that he does think he will be indicted probably sometime this week, the equivalent of arrest, I think. Is that right, Scotty?
That's what the rumors are. And if you read Trump's post that he did last week, yesterday was supposed to be the day. It didn't happen, mainly probably because he was the only one that was putting a timeline to it. But yes, there is a grand jury that is convened, but they're basing this, the district attorney of Manhattan is actually basing this whole case off of one testimony almost. And this is what you're going with Michael Cohen, whose lawyer himself has come in and just poked all sorts of holes into Michael Cohen's, including giving a personal vendetta Michael Cohen has against Donald Trump, showing this is why he's saying this. I cannot believe this man. So once again, 9 years later, ladies, or actually I think we're at what? 7 years later, we're meeting together on this morning to talk about Donald Trump. So whether he's indicted or he's not, this is winning to Donald Trump, because we're talking about him, and that's all that he cares about.
Dr. Schuller, I know you've got a view on that.
I think the culture of impunity must end. This is about accountability, and Donald Trump should be arrested and prosecuted for any crime that he's committed. That's the bottom line. The hush money to Stormy Daniels is potentially a cover-up for a campaign finance benefit, i.e. an undeclared payment on behalf of a presidential candidate to avoid a public scandal. Now, Stormy's point about personal vendetta, that's a talking point. It's not rooted in fact or in law. It is not the job of the state prosecutor to look at the politics surrounding an individual to determine whether or not to indict and prosecute them for a crime committed. The political position of Donald Trump as a current presidential candidate and as a former president only means the stakes are high. And whether or not, Trump has, this high position in politics or the threat of his followers protesting his legitimate arrest is something to be concerned about, I say it's not. It cannot be the litmus test for any civilized, law-abiding society. Nobody is above the law is the only standard you must stand by, period.
Shola, I agree with you. Nobody's above the law, but that's not the conversation that we're having here. Listen to your own answer. First, you said a state attorney. This is a case that has already been, Trump has been tried in a civil court and won, Stormy Daniels having to pay. This is a case that has already been thrown out by the federal justice system. You had multiple people begged to take on this case. They said, we have nothing to do with this. And you have Michael Cohen himself. The only person that is saying that campaign finances were used were Michael Cohen. Everybody else around is going, not so much. Now, as to this threat of Trump protesters, that was something that Donald Trump called for. He called for it on Tuesday. There was maybe a handful of people there. I think the American people, I think even his supporters recognize that right now that rallying to a city like New York is not a friendly place to those in the Trump base. So therefore, they stayed home. So that threat is non-existent, whether Trump takes that as a compliment or not.
Well, I'm listening to you, Scott. I'm listening to you, Scotty, and I wonder if you're listening to what you're saying. Fine, there was a civil case, but that's not what we're talking about here. As long as a prosecutor has a case that's supported by law and the facts, that is the issue. And the bottom line here is, it doesn't matter how long it took. That is not an argument not to prosecute somebody. Other people get prosecuted even though it takes forever and a half for it to happen, or it took 2 months for the prosecutors to put their case together. The bottom line is, as long as it's supported by law and the facts. And your point about Michael Cohen, well, let the court of law determine whether his evidence, his testimony is strong enough to prosecute Donald Trump. That is what the courts are
Ladies, I'm going to have to stop you there because we are out of time. Busy programme this hour, but I want you to come back and continue that conversation. Stay tuned.